In the import preference, we can determine how the After Effects will interpret the footage that we import. Here we have still footage, and we can have the still footage be the length of the composition, and this is standard because sometimes we may want to create an image that will serve as a background layer, and so we'll need it to be the entire length of the composition. Or we can set it to be only a certain size if we're not really going to use much of the actual image. And the reason we have to set this is because since it's a still image, it would only be one frame, and one frame in the actual rendered out composition would not even be visible. And so we're given a length to make that image visible in the timeline. Here we can also determine how the sequence footage is interpreted. Here you'll see that it's at 30 frames a second, and for each frame that was created, 30 of those frames will become 1 second of animation when we import it into After Effects, and it'll appear as a video. Here we can determine the alpha and how we use it. We can tell the computer to guess or which style of the alpha that we wanted. You can see here that we have unmatted, and that's the standard alpha without any color representing the alpha. Here we would just have ignore alpha, which would mean we would see the entire image. We can also have pre-multiplied with black or with white, and that would show us the actual alpha, but it would be black or white. The default is to ask the user, and that's because we don't want After Effects just selecting which alphas that we want to use if we didn't want to use it. And so we'll have the computer ask us in order to figure out which style we should use. And the default drag, we leave it as footage because if we were to bring it as a composition, then we would have a number of compositions within the project window, and they would just be too numerous, and the footage is much more useful to put into the composition rather than have the After Effects go through a bunch of nested comps. Here in the output, you'll see we have our overflow volumes, and what this is you can see I get a listing of disk drives that I can save my files to. So if I was creating a very, very large sequence or a very large movie, I could set this up just in case my computer began to get too full, and I could have it switch over to the next overflow volume. So here I have C or whatever. Here the defaults are none because we normally wouldn't work on a project that large, but if we did, we would be able to have it cut up into parts. That way it would continue to render and it would save it to another computer or another disk. And we could set up to 5 in order to catch the extra remaining part of the movie. That way we don't run out of space and the render just stops. Here we can also change the amount. Here it says segment sequences. So we have 700 files, and it would cut the entire movie into 700 files. We could also have it set it to be segmented once it reaches a certain size. Here we have the minimum disk space before overflowing. And what this is the amount of space that's left on the computer disk before the computer decides that it will move over to the next overflow volume. And here we have the audio block duration for the audio to determine how it would be in this overflow volume. And here we can choose to use either the default name and folder, or if we unselect this, it'll allow us to create our own. I'm going to skip ahead and go to the memory because it pertains more to the preferences that we're talking about right now. Here you can see the maximum memory usage, and here we can set how much memory the After Effects is using in order to run the program. Here it says that 120%, so that equals 766 megabytes, and it'll tell you how much of the actual processing that you're using. When we first open After Effects, it's usually at 100%, and that's just the memory that it has set aside in order to use. And we can go above 100% because we can tell After Effects to use more memory than it was originally set for. Here we have the RAM cache, which is part of the image cache, and that lets us use an image and it'll stay within the RAM of After Effects in order for After Effects to use it more efficiently. And we can also enable disk cache, which will use memory from the disk in order to keep our files. Now we'll go over our final set of preferences. Here we have the guides and grids. The grids will appear in the composition window, and here we can set the color for the grid, and we can set the style. Here we can choose lines, dashed lines, or dots. And we can tell the grid to appear for every number of pixels. Here we have it set to 80, and we have a number of subdivisions between each grid line. So each subdivision, here it's at 4, would appear between each grid. So since there's 4 subdivisions and each grid line is every 80 pixels, then at every 20 pixels we would have a subdivision. But if our subdivisions and our grid lines don't work out in the way that we wanted them to, let's say for instance the composition is a little bit wider than it originally needs to be, like say for instance the grid lines don't match up exactly with the composition, we can use the proportional grid, and we can set numbers here for the horizontal and vertical lines of the grid, and we can tell it that we want it cut into a number of pieces, and that's what this number represents. So the grid lines would cut each part of the composition into even proportional pieces, and we can set those numbers here. The guides work similar to the grids, except we can create the guides ourselves, and we can tell the difference by the color of the guide. And we can use lines or dashed lines for the guides. Here we also have our safe margins, which are our safe frames. And you can see here the default for the action safe is 10%, and the default for the title safe is 20%. And this percentage is from the edge of the composition inward. And so we can set this to be a higher number if we wanted a less area to work with and more of a safe frame, or we can set this lower if we needed more area with less of a safe frame for the titles or the action. Here we have the label colors, and we can change the colors by selecting the swatch or using the eyedropper, and then we can rename the title of that label and you can see that we have a number of labels and label colors that we can select. And here you'll see that we have the default for how each layer gets labeled. You can see here that lights are violet, cameras are red, solids are peach, and we can just select it in order to more easily view our layers in the project window and in the timeline window. Okay. Here we have video preview. Here we have the output device, and what this is if we were outputting to, say, a second monitor, we would be able to show in this port right here, in this point, whether or not we wanted to display everything, or what we wanted to display within that second monitor or that second viewing television, or any other device that might be placed installed to the computer. And so if we wanted to use the same exact video of what we have in our complete After Effects project, we can choose to show that, or we can just choose to show the final result video, which would be the composition window in the second monitor. Here we can change the user interface colors. Here you see it says use label color for handles and paths, and that'll determine the color of the motion path and the layer handles in the composition window. And we can select to cycle mask colors. Usually there'll be one color as a default, but if we're going to be working with quite a number of masks, we can select this to turn on, and it'll for each mask that's created, a new color will be placed on those handles for the mask. We can also select to highlight the entire row in the timeline, and this is in case we're using a lot of layers and a really long timeline. We can continue to work on one layer without getting confused about which layer we're working on. And here we have the Pasteboard Color, and this is the compositions workspace. When you look at the border of the composition, you'll notice that there's a grayish color on the outside, and that's what the pasteboard is. It's the area outside that we can still use the image files in, but we can't actually see anything because it's kind of like a matte. Here we have the hot text color, and these are the text within the menus and the like effects menu where they have the reset and the about, and in the render settings and stuff like that. The text is blue, and that allows us to know that we can click on that text and it'll bring us to another menu or into other options. Here you can see that we have user interface brightness, and this is another way that we can customize our interface by using this preference. And here you'll notice that once I go to a certain darkness, the text inverts so that I'm still able to see it. But I can determine how bright or dark that I want the actual screen to be for After Effects. And I can also tell it to affect the pasteboard color and the label color. So as I had files in my project window or in the timeline, the label colors would either be darker or lighter, depending on what I selected for the interface brightness. And the pasteboard color for the composition window would also be lighter or darker, depending on my settings for that.